Okay, so our fifth lecture is Peru Part 2, Truth Commissions, Transitional Justice and Accountability. Our guided questions are: what are truth commissions? What do they set out to do? What is transitional justice, and how has it taken shape in Latin America? How did the Peruvian Truth Commission differ from the ones that came before? What does the search for justice and accountability look like in Latin America? And to a larger scope, what are some contested memory narratives in Peru and in Argentina? Peru's Truth Commission report recognizes the role of civil society in defending human rights, rejecting in absolute the violence regardless of its origin or justification, and its support for an integral vision of human rights, which even included an analysis of the country's economic system, which resulted in an effort to understand the tensions that operated behind the violence. It was grassroots organizations which began to mobilize on the ground against the violence in the countryside during the early 1980s. State abuses were the first focus of human rights groups during the conflict. This focus was not due to a sympathy towards the Shining Path. Rather, the human rights groups were confined to the legal approach that required the state to respect international human rights law. Several of the state's actions against Shining Path members were heavily criticized by the public, such as the 1982 massacre of wounded Shining Path members in a hospital in Huamanga. However, human rights abuses by the Shining Path were also escalating and gaining the attention of the powerful sectors of society, mostly in Lima. In 1983, the massacre of peasants in Lucanamarca pushed human rights groups to seek a way to hold Shining Path accountable under international human rights law. They took an innovative approach in contrast to human rights movements in other regions, when they also decided to use international humanitarian law. The international humanitarian law focused on armed conflicts and therefore could hold both sides of the conflict responsible. This change allowed the collection of data on human rights abuses and violence perpetrated by the state, the Shining Path, and the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement. The involvement of civil society in the human rights movement revealed a need for an organized front, resulting in the creation of the National Coordinator of Human Rights in 1985. The coordinator became an effective instrument for victims of violence to find welcome and legal support. The victims included those arrested under terrorist activities or suspicion of terrorism. The same year as the creation of the coordinator, Lima hosted the first national meeting of human rights organisms. This moment serves to not only bring attention to a unified human rights front amongst the conflict, but the coordinator made a firm stand against the abuses of the Shining Path, losing the pragmatic support of the Shining Path up to this point. The Shining Path had utilized the human rights movement as a tool for detained and imprisoned members. The year 1985 also marked the first National March for Peace, backed by the coordinator. The march revealed the population's growing consciousness of violence in the countryside. By the third national meeting in 1989, the coordinator required the Shining Path to follow international human rights law. As the conflict proliferated, the human rights abuses fueled greater outrage from civil society. The 1986 prison massacre marked yet another pivotal moment for the Human Rights Front to address the abuses of the state. However, the efforts were met with rejection and denial. The counterinsurgency strategy maintained that the dangerous Shining Path presence in the prison justified the slaughter of hundreds of prisoners. In the 90s, Alberto Fujimori had the biggest challenge from the human rights movement. As the conflict escalated in the urban regions, especially Lima, the military declared certain shantytowns, quote, emergency zones. and installed bases, Fujimori hoped a strong military presence and abuse would drive the Shining Path away and regain the support of the disillusioned popular masses. Meanwhile, human rights abuses and violence continued to be denounced by the coordinator. The denunciations were magnified when the United States decided to pull aid from Peru in 1991, citing the human rights abuses by the state as driving factors. Fujimori's reaction was to blame human rights groups for a supposed intention to harm Peru's image, and therefore its economic recovery. The vilification of the coordinator continued to occur as Fujimori carried out his self-coup. The Peruvian government was not alone in blaming the coordinator and other human rights organizations for the loss of support or hindering their military strategy. The Shining Path was also an outspoken enemy from the start. Initially, the Shining Path limited itself to ideological attacks towards the Human Rights Front, condemning the bourgeois character of such organizations and the foreign forces that backed them. The Shining Path felt entitled to utilize human rights to play the system and aid members who had been captured. Yet, as the conflict and violence escalated, the Shining Path took more direct actions against individuals associated with human rights, assassinating popular leaders. Selective assassinations were a common tool of the Shining Path, and this did not stop following the capture of Abimael Guzman in September 1992. The Shining Path approached human rights and human rights organizations pragmatically, justifying their participation in the discourse as a means to undermine the larger human rights front and their class enemies. Vilified and threatened, the Peruvian Human Rights Front continued to denounce the abuses carried out by the two major groups during the armed conflict. They documented and exposed, on the ground, the human rights violations. The uncovering of the Cantuta massacre and the Barrios Altos massacre in 1992 helped fuel support for the coordinator and those seeking accountability from the state. This growing consciousness and support was evident in 1995 when the Fujimori government passed a series of impunity laws and was met with outrage and opposition from the population. The opposition political groups found in the human rights issue a highly effective element for the isolation of the regime and the fight against impunity, because at least during the decline of Fujimori, a common demand. Impunity became a common demand. The laws were nullified when Fujimori left power. To conclude our case study on Peru's internal armed conflict, we will go over some important human rights groups that emerged during the conflict and continue up to this day to fight for reparations and justice. The first is ANFACEP, the National Association of Relatives of the Kidnapped, Detained, and Disappeared of Peru. ANFACEP was created on September 2, 1983 by a brave indigenous women led by Angélica Mendoza de Ascarza, Teodosia Cuya Laime, and Antonia Saga Uaña. At the height of the violence in Ayacucho, the women who were mothers and wives of disappeared counted with the support of Huamanga's mayor, Leonor Zamora, who was later assassinated by state forces. Little after its formation, the group accounted for 800 mothers, wives, and relatives of kidnapped individuals. As of today, the organization has 200 members. The initial activities of ANFACEP consisted in the creation of a soup kitchen for orphan children and the poor during the conflict. The kitchens were improvised as early as 1984 and formally in 1985. Named after Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, the Argentine who won the Nobel Peace Prize for denouncing the abuses of the Argentine junta. Esquivel visited the soup kitchen and met with ANFACEP members in 1985. Alongside taking care of the most vulnerable victims of the conflict, the women searched for their relatives in the barracks, the streets, and dumps of corpses. a search that lasted entire days and meant neglecting their sons and daughters who were neglected in their basic needs as their mothers searched for their loved ones. The living conditions of families in refugee situations were also very poor, and they went without food or protection from the state, and many migrated from the highlands to the city. A second group is APRODE, the Association Pro Human Rights. Formed on September 12, 1983, APRODE was created as an NGO dedicated to the defense, promotion, and diffusion of human rights. APRODE addressed the judicial branch of human rights protections. Even now, APRODE continues to accompany victims and their organizations to find justice, advising and representing them before national and supranational courts. APRODE is also a founding member of the National Coordinator of Human Rights, and since 1990 is affiliated with the International Federation of Human Rights. APRODE had a leadership role in promoting the integrality of human rights and the formation process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The final group to highlight is the National Coordinator of Human Rights, as mentioned before, created in 1985. In 1985, a group of human rights organizations formed the Martyrs of Ushurahai Solidarity Committee to seek clarification of the murder of 9 journalists in that Ayacucho community. This committee is the antecedent of the Coordinator. Since its establishment, the Coordinator of Human Rights has become the first institution to reference in Latin America that brings together a group of human rights organizations in a country. Currently, the National Coordinator of Human Rights has a special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and is accredited to participate in the activities of the Organization of American States. The next part of our lecture aims to define truth commissions, as well as the process of transitional justice and accountability. A truth commission is a temporary body established with an official mandate to investigate human rights violations, identify the patterns and causes of violence, and publish a final report through a politically autonomous procedure. There are 5 fundamental characteristics of truth commissions that distinguish them from other investigatory bodies. First, it operates for a limited amount of time. Permanent organizations like human rights NGOs or parliamentary human rights commissions are therefore not truth commissions. The Truth Commission publishes a final report summarizing the main findings and making recommendations, usually submitted to the political institution that created it, such as the president in the case of Peru, and it is common practice to make the final report available to the general public. A Truth Commission examines a limited number of past events and violations that occurred over a period of time, investigating not only incidents of violence and violations, but patterns, causes, and consequences. The Truth Commission enjoys autonomy from direct intervention by political actors. A Truth Commission mark of distinction is that its operation and final report are independent of the authority that establishes it. A crucial test for autonomy is whether or not the political decision makers alter the content of the final result. And lastly, truth commissions are official in character in the sense that a state institution or an international organization authorizes the commissioners to undertake the truth-finding task. Non-governmental fact-finding bodies are not truth commissions. It cannot be denied that efforts to come to terms with the legacy of the political violence usually originate with civil society actors prior to the establishment of official commissions. The meticulous documentation of abuses by human rights groups in Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and Peru under high-risk conditions laid the groundwork for truth commissions in those countries, and in countries like Brazil and Uruguay, they help preserve historical memory. Not all truth commissions succeed in producing available record of human rights violations. Some commissions fail to publish a report, and in other cases, social and political actors attempts to establish a truth commission fail. Failed truth commission attempts teach two valuable lessons. First, a minimal degree of government support is necessary to have any truth commission. Second, a commission that fails or is not allowed to publish its final report produces no process-driven impact. That is, in part because the content of a commission's final report matters. Politicians and public officials make use of the findings and recommendations for policy reform, either willingly or under pressure from civil society actors. According to Bakiner, three types of truth commissions have emerged in the context of democratic transitions and peace processes: first generation transitional, second generation transitional, and non-transitional. The first generation transitional were established to investigate human rights violations under military dictatorship, such is the case in Argentina. Presidential initiatives proved critical to the establishment of these commissions, and the preferred legal instrument to set up the mandate was a presidential decree. For the early commissions, the immediacy of establishing a historical record on death and forced disappearances set limits on the investigation. Other human rights violations, such as torture, illegal imprisonment, sexual violence, and forced exile, were either not investigated at all or discussed in generic terms. This commission conceived the truth as factual rather than historical. The methodology was limited and the process was technical rather than performative. This meant no public hearings or lengthy public testimonies. Most second-generation commissions set up in the 1990s to the 2000s addressed civil war and internal armed conflict between the government forces and insurgent groups, such is the case of Guatemala and Peru. Almost all of these truth commissions came into existence within 1 year of transition to peace and/or democracy. Most importantly, the second generation broadened the scope of investigations beyond death and disappearance to encompass a wide array of violations. Peru's Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2001 decided to produce comprehensive histories of national tragedy. It confronted the task of explaining the historical and structural roots of political violence, such as intersecting class and ethnic cleavages, which played out in the perpetuation of inequality, marginalization, and exclusion. The commissioners realized that reaching out to victims meant nothing less than bridging the enormous geographical, social, and emotional gaps between the vulnerable populations in the periphery and the cultural political centers. The third kind, the non-transitional kind of truth commissions, were truth commissions established under consolidated democracies, such as in Uruguay and Brazil. Thus, truth commissions expanded from transitional to non-transitional regimes, from the developing to the developed world, and from investigating a narrow set of violations to a broad range of injustices. Up to the 1970s, the tradition in Latin America had been that leaders responsible for human rights violations would go into exile abroad, where they would be given protection, if not affection. This had long been a political tradition in Latin America. Historian Greg Grandin argues the Truth Commissions indexed a unique moment in Latin American history as the decline of socialist movements crossed paths with ascendant efforts to consolidate liberal constitutional rule. Thus, the Latin American turn to truth commissions was a result of a changing political context that addresses the decline of socialist movements, but involves a transitional period which liberal democracy was imposed on the continent. The liberal turn, backed by the influence of the United States and fall of the Soviet Union, represents the continuing challenges to overcome the influence of empire. As we will see, Sicking links the transition closer to human rights successes, arguing that the change in perspective and the viability of human rights prosecutions in Latin America changes in 1983 when the Argentine human rights movement started publicly demanding trials for past violations. A second watershed moment for criminal accountability came in October 1998, when General Augusto Pinochet of Chile was arrested in London by British police executed a Spanish extradition request. So political scientist Catherine Sicking breaks down the criminal prosecutions for human rights violations into three basic types. The first is international. International trials happen when states, typically acting on behalf of the United Nations, set up tribunals such as the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court. The second is foreign, meaning that the state decides to use its domestic courts to try an official from another state, sometimes using a procedure known as universal jurisdiction, such as the example of Pinochet, tried in the United Kingdom and Spain. The third is domestic, the most common type. It is when courts within the country where the human rights violations occurred assume the task of trying the human rights criminals. This new trend of accountability, Sicking coins the justice cascade. Sicking states, I do not mean perfect justice has been done or will be done, or that most perpetrators of human rights violations will be held criminally accountable. Rather, justice cascade means that there has been a shift in the legitimacy of the norm of individual criminal accountability for human rights violations and an increase in criminal prosecutions on behalf of that norm. So the justice norm. There are three key ideas on the justice norm, ideas that took centuries of belief in the state and took a major movement to change. The first, the most basic violations of human rights, the summary executions, torture, and disappearance cannot be legitimate acts of the state and thus must be seen as crimes committed by individuals. The second is that individuals who commit these crimes can be and should be prosecuted. And the third is that ideas that the accused are also bearers of rights and deserve to have those rights protected in a fair trial. Moving on to accountability. So accountability are practices where some actors hold other actors to a set of standards and impose sanctions if the standards are not met. States have used three types of models for accountability for past human rights violations. The first is the immunity or impunity model, where no one is held accountable for human rights violations. The second is the state accountability model, where the state is held accountable for human rights violations, and it provides remedies and pays damages. The third is the individual criminal accountability model, where individuals are prosecuted and if convicted, they go to prison. These new practices of accountability would not have emerged without the combination of new human rights movements, new human rights law, and regional institutions to implement that law. Like the broader human rights revolution we read for week one, the justice cascade is a result of deliberate, strategic organizing by rights advocates. It's part of a bigger movement for accountability for past human rights violations. Trials are not the only or even the most important way countries grapple with human rights violations. Today, states use truth commissions, state and on-state actors to set up memory sites, archives, and oral history projects. Many states have provided reparations for victims of past human rights violations to compensate them or their families for imprisonment or death. It is now common to refer to these efforts also as transitional justice. The case of Fujimori. So Fujimori was convicted in 2009 for his role in the 1992 Cantuta and Barrios Altos massacres. Political scientist Jo Marie Burt states, the Fujimori trial and verdict had been hailed by international law and human rights experts as an unimpeachable legal process that marked a watershed in anti-impunity efforts in Peru and around the globe. Yet, on Christmas Eve 2017, Peruvian President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski pardoned ex-President Alberto Fujimori from charges of crimes against humanity under humanitarian grounds. The decision sparked outrage and mobilizations throughout the country and the world. The pardon of Fujimori undermined the process of the Peruvian judicial process and undermined the process that the Peruvian judicial courts had made in holding key figures accountable and betrayed the promise the verdict had made to the victims and families involved. Kuczynski was portrayed as a traitor by media outlets. For many Peruvians had chosen to elect him because of his opposition to impunity and because his rival was the daughter of Fujimori. Marisa Glave, a member of Congress, declared to the New York Times, quote, "There will be no peace, no democracy, or justice when the pain of the family members who are victims of the atrocities of Fujimori and Montesinos is not respected." End quote. The role of Peru and the Human Rights Front in the Justice Cascade had been an upscale battle, and the humanitarian pardon signified a significant leap back. For this week, you are required to watch the documentary The Fall of Fujimori, read a brief article by Jo Marie Burt on Fujimori's trial, and read some short articles regarding the events after the film was made. As you watch and read this material, keep in mind Greg Grandin's article, as well as the material covered today in lecture. And so, we return to our guided questions. What are truth commissions, and what do they set out to do? What is transitional justice, and how has it taken shape in Latin America? How did the Peruvian Truth Commission differ from the ones that came before? What does the search for justice and accountability look like in Latin America? And for the larger scope, what are some contested memory narratives in Peru and in Argentina?